when President Trump landed in Dayton, Ohio yesterday. He was met by protesters chanting two words.
Do something! Do something! Do something!
Do something. Those were the same words Ohio's Republican Governor Mike DeWine heard when he spoke at a vigil earlier this week. And since then, DeWine has proposed new gun control legislation calling for a so-called red flag law and expanded background checks. Is there any chance we might see something similar to that in Washington?
NPR's lead political editor, Domenico Montanaro, has been following this and joins us this morning. Hi, Domenico.
Good morning.
So interest in this so-called red flag bill seems to at least be getting some traction in Congress. Can you explain what it would be?
Well, these are technically called extreme risk laws or extreme risk protection orders. They allow for police to temporarily take guns away from some people when someone close to them reports that they hear something that strikes them in an odd way or a wrong way. More than a dozen states have passed these kinds of laws in recent years. They've been shown to be effective, particularly at preventing suicides. It's something that's gotten a lot of attention from Republicans and Democrats of late, spearheaded in the Senate, particularly by Lindsey Graham, the Republican from South Carolina.
Right. So does Lindsey Graham have enough influence to convince the rest of his Republican colleagues to support it?
Well, you've heard it from a lot of people, and it's quite possible. We've actually seen movement with a couple Republicans who've now moved on wanting even more gun restrictions beyond just these red flag laws in recent days. Thinking of Mike Turner of Ohio, who represents the Dayton area, and Adam Kinzinger of Illinois, for example. They've come out and said that they're now in favor of stricter gun restrictions, which is a real big about face, especially for Turner, who was endorsed by the National Rifle Association before his election in 2018. Of course, a couple of Republican congressmen doesn't make a majority. Universal background check legislation has already passed the Democratic-controlled House, too, so a couple congressmen doesn't make a difference there. The Senate's a different story. That's controlled by Republicans. Republican leader Mitch McConnell shown no interest in bringing forward anything on stricter gun restrictions. But you have to wonder if Republicans aren't quite feeling the same kind of pressure they had in recent years, given that the National Rifle Association has had so many internal problems we've heard so much about.
What's the Democratic 2020 field saying about this debate in this moment?
Well, Democrats have been laying blame at the feet of President Trump. They say that his rhetoric is dangerous and inspiring these kinds of acts, especially what we saw in El Paso with the anti-immigrant screed that we saw so much evidence for from the shooter. In fact, here was former Vice President Joe Biden delivering a major speech about exactly that.
This president has fanned the flames of white supremacy in this nation. His low energy, vacant-eyed mouthing of the words written for him, condemning white supremacists this week, I don't believe fooled anyone, at home or abroad.
And plenty of Democratic candidates have gone even further than that and are itching to say so.
NPR's lead political editor, Domenico Montanaro. Thanks.
You're welcome.
U.S. Immigration and Customs agents carried out the largest statewide workplace enforcement operation in U.S. history yesterday.
Yeah, we're talking about a highly coordinated sting here. Hundreds of agents surrounded 7 food processing plants across Mississippi. About 680 workers, the majority of them Latino, were arrested and transported to a military hangar. In addition to the arrests, agents also seized business records from the company. At a press conference yesterday, Mike Hurst, U.S. Attorney for the Southern District of Mississippi, had this to say about the operation.
But while we do welcome folks from other countries, they have to follow our laws. They have to abide by our rules. They have to come here legally, or they shouldn't come here at all.
Jeff Almy of the Associated Press was the first to break this story and is on the line with us this morning. Hi, Jeff.
Good morning.
What other details can you share about how these raids went down?
Well, ICE and federal prosecutors told us yesterday afternoon that they had been investigating these 5 companies for more than a year after they got tips that they were employing people who didn't have authorization to work in the United States. Mm-hmm. The agents fanned out before 8 o'clock in the morning. They surrounded these plants. They detained people who they thought didn't have authorization. They zip-tied their hands behind their backs and loaded them on buses and took them to the Air National Guard hangar that adjoins the Jackson airport. They had a very large operation set up inside the hangar. ICE invited the Associated Press in for a look before folks started arriving. They had 7 lines, one for each raid, to process people with fingerprint scanners and printers for documents. They had fans with misters going to try to keep the hangar cool on what had been predicted to be the hottest day of the year so far in Jackson.
You said
the hangar is,
I'm sorry to interrupt you. You mentioned that the officials, ICE agents, detained people they believed to be in the country working without proper documentation. I mean, presumably they would have some kind of evidence to demonstrate that, right? Or is there a chance that they swept up people who do have authorization?
It's unclear to me, honestly. We're hoping that some of this is going to become a little clearer today. Supposedly, we're going to get some figures on who was arrested and who might have been let go. Their position was that they brought in what they called foreign nationals subject to arrest. And they said that they questioned people out at the plants and that they only brought in people who admitted that they were not from the United States and that they believed were in the country illegally.
What does this mean for the companies? This has affected 4 different food processing plants, chicken processing facilities, is that right?
Five companies operating a total of 7 facilities.
So do they stay open?
Presumably they're going to stay open. The company that had the most facilities raided, a company called Pica, which is based in Tuscaloosa, Alabama, said that it was facing a potential production disruption, but it was unclear what they really meant by that, whether that was a day or a week or something longer than that.
Or, I mean, the other question, do they get fined? I mean, for employing people who aren't legal to work in the country?
Federal prosecutors and ICE said that they were investigating the companies for potential criminal violations. They wouldn't go any farther than that.
Okay.
And so that's yet to be seen.
Okay. Meanwhile, all these people are waiting in this military hangar to find out what their fate is. Jeff Almy with the Associated Press, we appreciate you sharing your reporting.
Thank you.
Puerto Rico has sworn in its 3rd governor in the span of just a week.
Yeah, it's amazing. Wanda Vasquez, who was previously the island's Secretary of Justice, was sworn into office last night, despite the fact that she said she had no interest in this role just a week ago. So her appointment comes after Puerto Rico's Supreme Court ruled that her predecessor, Pedro Pierluisi, was unconstitutionally sworn in as governor last week. And this political crisis in Puerto Rico, we should remember, comes after weeks of demonstrations that forced Governor Ricardo Rosselló to resign.
Okay, we've got NPR's Adrian Florido in San Juan to explain what exactly is going on. Hi, Adrian.
Hi, Rachel.
So Wanda Vasquez, she is now the governor of Puerto Rico. But as David noted, initially, when it was clear that Ricardo Rosselló was going to have to leave, she had said she didn't want this job. So why did she change her mind?
Well, Puerto Rico's constitution says that the person who replaces a resigning governor is the Secretary of State. But that post was vacant last week, and so the next in line is the Justice Secretary. That would be Wanda Vasquez. And like you said, she didn't want the job, so she asked Governor Rosselló to appoint a Secretary of State so that that person could take over when he stepped down. Rosselló did that. He appointed veteran politician Pedro Pierluisi. And when he stepped down last Friday, Pierluisi took the oath of office. But yesterday, the Supreme Court said, wait a minute, you were never confirmed as Secretary of State by the legislature as the Constitution requires, so you can't be governor. And so he had to step down, and Wanda Vasquez became governor yesterday.
So, I mean, what are Puerto Ricans making of all this?
I mean, it's been quite a couple of weeks here with people's heads just spinning at all of the sort of twists and turns that all this has taken. It all started a few weeks ago with these massive protests that you mentioned against Governor Ricardo Rosselló that were at first about these offensive text messages that he sent, but eventually sort of evolved into protests against what a lot of Puerto Ricans view as a corrupt political establishment. And they view Rosselló as part of that establishment, his successor, Pedro Pierluisi, as part of that establishment, and now, Governor Wanda Vázquez, they also view as part of that establishment. So yesterday, I spoke with a protester who went to the governor's mansion to demand that Wanda Vázquez resign. Listen to what Yanira Arias said.
El pueblo les está diciendo que está cansado de que no haya un liderazgo real.
What's she saying?
She's saying people are tired of leaders who haven't been able to address problems like Puerto Rico's economic crisis that's forced so many people to leave the island, its high rates of poverty, its debt crisis. And so they look at people like Wanda Vázquez, who has close ties to Rosselló, and they aren't happy and they want something new.
So she's, based on what you're saying, it doesn't sound like Wanda Vázquez is going to be long for this job.
Well, there were questions about whether she might assume the office and then appoint a Secretary of State and resign. But she went on public television late last night to give her first address as governor and didn't give any indication that she would be resigning. It sounded like she didn't expect it to fulfill the rest of the term. There's a possibility that something might happen because it's been impossible to predict anything in the last few weeks. So I'll keep an eye on it.
Who knows? NPR's Adrian Florido is covering all the twists and turns in Puerto Rico. We appreciate it, Adrian. It took New Zealand only 6 days to announce a proposal to change gun laws after a deadly attack on 2 mosques there earlier this year. A month later, the government in New Zealand put in place a sweeping ban on military-style weapons.
Yeah, change has come a little slower here in the United States in the aftermath of 2 more deadly mass shootings. Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell said yesterday that the chamber will discuss measures to address gun violence when Congress returns from summer break in September. Among those measures on the table, so-called red flag laws, which would get guns out of the hands of people deemed dangerous, and also the idea of expanding background checks.
NPR's congressional correspondent Susan Davis is in the studio to talk about this. Hi, Sue.
Good morning.
So what is Senator McConnell proposing? Is he actually proposing something?
He's promising a debate. He is not promising that there will be a law signed at the end of this. He also made clear he is not interested in taking up a broad gun debate in the Senate, but a more narrow debate focused on proposals that could have more support. This is what he told local Kentucky radio.
We had that ban for about a 10-year period. There were a good deal of dispute about whether it actually had an impact or not. It's certainly one of the front and center issues. I think with probably background checks and red flags would probably lead the discussion.
He's essentially ruling out things like a ban on high-capacity weapons, things like the quote-unquote assault weapons ban.
That's what he's referring to.
Yes, the 10-year ban.
We had that for 10 years.
There is already a background check on the bill on the table that's been passed out of the House that would expand the background check requirements to cover more gun sales. Although we should note, when they passed this back in February, President Trump threatened to veto.
So why is McConnell? I mean, it is significant that he's even opening a debate, right? Because he hasn't wanted to do that. What's led to the change of heart?
Part of this is being driven by President Trump now. McConnell acknowledged that as well. Here he is again on local radio.
The president called me this morning about this. He's anxious to get an outcome, and so am I. And I believe the Democrats will have to just admit that it's better to get a result than just engage in this sort of endless point scoring that has a tendency to occur after one of these awful, awful incidents.
There are a couple of bipartisan proposals in the Senate on those red flag laws and on background checks. But so far this year, McConnell had not shown any interest in having a gun debate. So that is movement on this. There is also no timeline. He said when they come back in the fall, but he didn't mean necessarily in September. It was a very broad, when we get back, we'll take a look at this. So again, promising a debate, not an outcome.
What do the numbers say? I mean, at this point, when you look at the Senate, do you see enough Republicans willing to get behind the idea of universal background checks or an assault weapons ban, for that matter?
Yeah, I mean, again, assault weapons ban, really unlikely. But there are a number of Republicans who say they want to do things. People like Lindsey Graham of South Carolina, Rob Portman of Ohio, where, of course, one of these mass shootings just took place. As always in the Senate, you need 60 votes. It is the bare minimum you need to move forward with legislation, particularly legislation that is controversial. And gun legislation of any variety has not been able to find that level of support. The last time the Senate made a really sincere push to try and get something done on gun-related legislation was after the Sandy Hook Elementary School shootings in 2012. They tried to expand background checks then. They only got 54 votes. That has been sort of the high water mark for support for changes to gun laws for the last decade. We'll see if that meter's moved.
All right, NPR congressional correspondent Susan Davis. Thanks, Sue.
You're welcome.
Okay, President Trump has announced his new pick for acting director of national intelligence. He made the announcement last night.
Yeah, it's retired Vice Admiral Joseph McGuire. He is set to replace outgoing acting director of national intelligence Dan Coats. And this comes as kind of a surprise to some in the intelligence community who believed that Sue Gordon, the country's number 2 intelligence official under Coats, would take the top job. Instead, the president announced yesterday that she would be resigning. The Director of National Intelligence is a post that was created after the 9/11 attacks to oversee the 17 civilian and military intelligence agencies.
NPR's Franco Ordonez is here to talk about this story. Good morning, Franco.
Good morning.
So we should just say this is a very important job, the DNI, right? They oversee, as David said, all the intelligence agencies. And the president has tapped Joseph McGuire as the acting director of national intelligence. Who is he?
Well, he is currently the director of the National Counterterrorism Center. He had over a 3-decade career in the U.S. Navy before retiring in 2010. He's had commands in the Navy SEALs and the Naval Special Warfare Command. And he comes from a family of service members. His father served in World War II. His brothers were in the Navy as well. His wife, Kathy, she was actually given the Defense Department's Distinguished Special Service Award for her support of wounded service members.
Okay, so a qualified person for this job. Sue Gordon was also qualified for this job. She was the number 2 at the ODNI, the Office of the Director of National Intelligence. And how the protocol works is that she would have been in line for this job, right? So she's out now. What does that say about the president's relationship to the intelligence community?
It shows the challenges that this president has had with the intelligence community. I mean, it's a lot of musical chairs, clearly. Sue Gordon's departure definitely made naming McGuire a lot easier. As you pointed out, experts say, according to the federal statute, she actually should have been elevated to the acting director position, but that was until her departure was announced. The reality is she's part of an intelligence community that Trump has had issues with. Trump wanted to put in place a loyal supporter, Congressman John Ratcliffe, to the top position, but those plans fell apart about questions about his resume. As you noted, Trump effectively fired the 1 and 2 officials at the DNI. Putting in place an acting person means no confirmation hearing, and that is important because it means no public airing of what led to the changes.
So Sue Gordon was close to Dan Coats, who stepped down and had his fair share of tensions with the president. You said, Joseph McGuire, clearly very qualified. Is he going to be someone who's in lockstep with the president?
Well, I mean, the position was just announced. Trump, said on Twitter very nice and kind things, but, we're still a lot learning. It's been less than 24 hours. Gordon, as you noted, had a lot of support from members of Congress. Senator Richard Burr, he's the chairman of the Senate Intelligence Committee. He called her a trusted partner. But McGuire also has support. He was confirmed in his current role. Dan Coats himself said that McGuire will lead the men and women of the Intelligence Commission with distinction. And being a former admiral running the NTC also gives McGuire some street credibility. And given his background and the controversy about Ratcliffe, he's likely to have a better go at it.
Right. It's not like he's an outsider to the establishment
Absolutely.
As the head of the NCTC. Okay, Franco Ordonez, we appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you.
We're going to turn next to the story of a Michigan man who was found dead in Iraq this week, 2 months after he was deported by U.S. immigration officials.
His name was 41-year-old Jimmy Al-Daoud. He was detained by U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement as part of a White House order that ramped up deportations of anyone convicted of a felony. ICE officials in Detroit say that al-Dawood entered the United States legally in 1979 when he was a year old. Michigan police records show that al-Dawood pleaded guilty to criminal charges at least 15 times over the course of nearly 20 years prior to his deportation. Those include assault, breaking and entering, resisting arrest, disorderly conduct, and home invasion. Friends and family say he was diabetic and also struggled with mental health issues.
There's Jane Raff is on the line from Iraq. She's been covering this story. Jane, tell us more. I mean, what do we know about Jimmy al-Dawood's time in Iraq?
Well, Rachel, he was deported in June, part of that series of sweeps by ICE. And next thing he knew, he was being put on a series of flights where he inexplicably was deported to the Shia holy city of Najaf. Dawood is Christian. He landed with no money, no Iraqi ID, and only broken Arabic. And then he ended up in the street in Baghdad.
So I guess I don't understand, Jane. Can you clarify, if he came to the U.S. legally, what were the grounds for deporting him?
So under these sweeps, pretty much anyone who has ever been convicted of a felony and also has any sort of immigration irregularities, even though they are legally in the United States, have been being deported. I've spoken to quite a few of these people. One of them had a conviction she served time for 20 years ago and was deported. And Dawood fell into that category. He was in Baghdad where he said he did a video saying that he was in the street, he was homeless, he was vomiting, he couldn't get enough to eat. So then his family sent him money for a place to stay and insulin, but he was terrified. He'd been diagnosed in the U.S. as being bipolar and schizophrenic, and in Baghdad he was too scared to go to the hospital. So on Monday, his sister tells us she got a call saying that he was dead.
And I refuse. That's that I've never been there. I've been in this country my whole life, since pretty much birth. I missed birth by 6 months.
And that was Dawood.
Went down the wrong path. My dad's parenting, I don't know what it is, but he said, I would rather die in the prison of the United States than live one more day here in Iraq. And I think his depression got to him.
A little confusion with the clips, but that
Bolus.
second clip was his sister, correct?
That is his sister, Mary. And she says those assault charges were fights with their father. She says all the kids were terrified of their dad. He broke into abandoned houses, his friends say, when he was homeless. So universally, they describe him as a sweet but troubled guy. And his sister says he was born in Greece. He'd never been to Iraq. It's hard for Iraqis to get help here. Someone who doesn't speak the language, doesn't have documents, doesn't really stand much of a chance.
And this is the case for other individuals who you've followed, people who've been deported to Iraq and have had a hard time, right?
Absolutely. All of these people are sent here without Iraqi documents. They're basically just dumped here. Another deportee we've covered, named Nasser al-Shimri, has been here more than a year now, and he's still terrified. He's covered in tattoos. He speaks with an American accent. He's been beat up several times. He talked to Dawood a week before he died, and he said Dawood, who was his friend, told him he wanted to kill himself. And that's something we hear a lot. Shimri says that Dawood was somebody who needed to be taken care of, that he never would have survived in Iraq.
NPR's Jane Raff covering this story. Thanks, Jane. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
Jeffrey Epstein, the wealthy financier awaiting trial on sex trafficking charges, was found dead inside a Manhattan jail cell Saturday from an apparent suicide.
It's not yet clear why Epstein wasn't being monitored more closely. Just a few weeks ago, he was found unconscious in his jail cell with marks on his neck, suggesting a possible suicide attempt. The day before Epstein's death, thousands of court documents from a civil suit were released, detailing how he lured girls as young as 14 years old into a sex trafficking ring that he operated from 2002 to 2005.
All right, let's learn more about what happened here from NPR's Ryan Lucas, who covers the Justice Department and has been reporting on it. Hi, Ryan.
Good morning.
So give us the latest. What do we know about how Epstein ended up dead while in custody?
Well, there still aren't a lot of answers to the questions that we have, really. We do know, as you mentioned, Epstein was found at about 6:30 a.m. on Saturday morning in his cell at the Metropolitan Correctional Center in New York City. His death has raised so many questions, in part because, as you mentioned earlier, In July, Epstein had been put on suicide watch after this apparent suicide attempt. Now, a source tells me that he was taken off of that suicide watch in late July. He was only on it for a couple of days. He was put instead into a cell along with a cellmate, and prison staff was to check on him every 30 minutes. I'm told that in the hours leading up to his death, the cellmate was not there and Epstein was not being checked on. The cellmate had been transferred out. No one had been brought back in to replace him so that there was someone in the cell at all times with Epstein. That's what should have happened under protocol, I'm told. So still a lot of questions on that. Now, the New York City's chief medical examiner said yesterday that her office had conducted an autopsy, but they said that they hadn't reached a determination as to the cause of death, pending further information.
But tell me about the hours and days leading up to his death, because a lot was happening in the case, right?
Well, I mean, this case has generated an enormous amount of publicity and media attention in the U.S. here and over the world. On Friday, though, a big thing happened, and that's these hundreds and hundreds of court documents related to Epstein were made public. That's by court order. These were related to a defamation case, to a lawsuit that was brought by one of the women who says that she was sexually abused and trafficked by Epstein. Some of the court records were sworn depositions. You had a whole host of documents that were in there, but there are new allegations of how Epstein brought underage girls into this alleged sex trafficking ring. There are also new allegations against other prominent men who allegedly had sex with girls through Epstein. They include former New Mexico Governor Bill Richardson and former U.S. Senator George Mitchell. They both, though, have denied the allegations.
Okay, so this goes forward now. I mean, you have the Justice Department Inspector General who's going to be looking into this. Attorney General William Barr said in a statement that this death raised serious questions. But then you have, I mean, just these allegations. I mean, Epstein accused of sex crimes against minors. I'm just thinking about the alleged victims here and their search for some kind of justice. What options are still left for them?
Well, you have the U.S. Attorney for the Southern District of New York has said that his investigation will continue. The case into Epstein is done, but one of the charges was conspiracy, sex trafficking conspiracy. So that investigation will go forward. There's a possibility of conspirators being prosecuted in that case. And then there's also the possibility of civil cases that victims can bring, and they can pursue that avenue as well.
NPR's Ryan Lucas covering the story for us. Ryan, thanks so much.
Thank you.
All right, the Iowa State Fair traditionally has been kind of a more easygoing campaign event for presidential candidates.
Right. You know this, David. I mean, you go there, you see candidates chowing down on deep-fried foods, taking a lot of selfies with voters. This week, though, the whole thing had a different kind of tone. Days after the mass shootings in Texas and Ohio, many of the Democratic candidates just set aside all the fun and games and released their plans for reducing gun violence.
All right, NPR political correspondent Scott Detrow spent the weekend with the candidates in Iowa and at the fair and joins us. Hi there, Scott.
Hey, good morning.
Okay, so what are the Democratic candidates saying in terms of what their plans would be if elected to confront gun violence in America?
A lot of consensus on policies like universal expanded background checks. Senator Elizabeth Warren rolled out a new plan this weekend proposing raising taxes on guns and ammunition and also holding firearms manufacturers and CEOs liable for gun violence. Former Vice President Joe Biden wrote an op-ed in the New York Times this morning arguing for a new assault weapon ban and talking about how that was a key part of that 1994 crime bill that he's really been on the defensive over so far. A lot of candidates are like Senator Kamala Harris as well. They say executive action would be a big part of their approach, given the decades of congressional gridlock on this.
But what I've heard from the candidates, and you tell me because you were so much closer, is that this conversation has not just been about guns. I mean, after Dayton, after El Paso, it seems like a much broader conversation.
Absolutely, and that's so striking because as important as gun control is for Democrats, it's really taken a back seat. And a big focus is on the rise in white nationalism, the kind that allegedly sparked the El Paso shooting. The candidates are all saying that President Trump's words and actions have emboldened white nationalism. I interviewed Kamala Harris on her campaign bus, and I asked her how, as president, she would fix this.
These are acts and expressions that are born out of hate, which under this administration has received new fuel. And part of the role and the power of the President of the United States is to use her microphone in a way that is about elevating public discourse and is a way that in a way that is about lifting people up, not beating them down. That's not what we've seen in this president.
Scott, I mean, dealing with such weighty subjects, but this fair and being in Iowa is also an opportunity for Kamala Harris and others to distinguish themselves, right? And kind of to show their fun side at moments as a potential president. Like, how did they strike that balance?
You know, a lot of the conversation about gun violence and white nationalism happened at a forum that had been set up elsewhere in Iowa at the last minute after this violence. But at the fair, there still was a lot of room for the retail politics and the approaches to the fair. You know, there were different styles on display. Harris, Warren, Biden had this big presence, a ton of supporters and media. A lot of the other candidates got to do a lot more one-on-one retailing and get a chance to actually enjoy the fair like normal people, ride the rides even. One striking thing about Biden early in this trip, he looked very strong. He gave a powerful speech about Trump and white nationalism, had a big reception at the fair. But over the weekend, he had several verbal slip-ups, including mistakenly saying the Parkland shooting happened when he was vice president, and that opened the door to some questions about his performance.
Did you get time to enjoy the fair? Do you like eating?
I had the maple glazed pork belly on a stick and the bacon wrapped corn dog, and both were excellent.
Okay, so the answer is yes. You did get a little time to enjoy the fair. NPR's Scott Detrow on the campaign trail. Scott, thanks so much.
Thank you.
All right, we're going to now go to Hong Kong, where authorities are saying they are suspending all flights at this time.
Right. This comes as pro-democracy protesters. They've been out demonstrating on the streets for 10 straight weeks now. And this transpired again this past weekend. Police were clashing with protesters in several downtown districts, and things got violent. Because of the demonstrations at the airport in Hong Kong, officials have now canceled all flights, as David noted.
All right, NPR's Anthony Kuhn observed these events as they played out over the weekend and joins us now from Hong Kong. Hi, Anthony.
Hey there, David.
Let's start with the situation at the airport. What we know about the suspended flights and what this could mean.
Well, this is one of the busiest airports in Asia. Police said there are now about 5,000 protesters there. And now, because flights have been canceled, protesters are worried that the police may try to flush them out by force. And it's not clear whether this was a government strategy or not, but it certainly inconveniences a lot of people. And it could be part of a strategy to, you know, pin it on the protesters and make it seem like they're disrupting people's lives.
So how violent were these clashes over the weekend? I mean, you were out there. Take me to the streets and what did it feel like as you were watching this?
Well, what happens in these sort of hit-and-run guerrilla-style protests is the protesters get out there and they barricade the streets. They throw stones and Molotov cocktails at police. Then the police come in firing tear gas and rubber bullets. They beat protesters with batons. They arrest some of them. They clear the streets, and then they reopen them to traffic. And then the remaining protesters move on to the next district. And this repeated itself over and over again in many downtown areas, about 4 of them yesterday. So it just keeps on going, very fast and fluid.
So the police response you're describing, I mean, it sounds like, I mean, potentially police brutality. How are people handling that question?
A lot of people here sure see it that way. They feel that the police did a lot of unnecessary beating, firing of rubber bullets and tear gas at close range. They even fired tear gas into the subway where it's hard for those gases to disperse.
Oh, wow.
There were also allegations that undercover cops dressed as protesters were stirring up violence, which riot police then moved in to quell. Now, the police say they're just, responding to threats to their safety. They used minimum force to disperse the protesters. There have been scores of injuries we hear about over the weekend. There have not been fatalities, but people perceive this as brutality, and this fueled a big turnout of protesters at the airport.
Can you just talk broadly about where this is all headed, the role of mainland China, what these protesters want? I mean, what are we expecting in the days and weeks ahead?
Well, let me say something about the role of the mainland. I was in this neighborhood yesterday called the North Point, and a lot of people who live there are pro-Beijing. They're immigrants from mainland China, and there have been a lot of fights there, and they seem to be spoiling for a fight and warning that if the protesters came, they'd let them have it. But the police managed to keep them apart. They blocked off the streets, and there were no big fights. But the perception is that these are gangs in Hong Kong to do Beijing's bidding. And as far as, where things are headed, The police could do mass arrests. That would shut things down. Beijing could send in the military. That would shut things down. But neither of these looks like they're about to happen. So it looks like this could grind on for quite a long time. And what is the new normal is, in fact, very difficult for people to live a normal life in.
All right, NPR's Anthony Kuhn speaking to us from Hong Kong about the recent protest there. Anthony, thanks so much for your reporting. We appreciate it.
You're welcome, David.
Give us your tired, you're poor. Those lines, etched on the Statue of Liberty by poet Emma Lazarus, are part of our common understanding about what America is, what it has stood for since its founding. Yesterday, a top immigration official in the White House, Ken Cuccinelli, said he's, quote, certainly not prepared to take anything down off the Statue of Liberty. But at the same time, a new administration rule will fundamentally change who gets to come to this country.
Yeah, so this rule targets immigrants who use public assistance like food stamps, housing vouchers, Medicaid. Under the new regulation, those immigrants will find it far more difficult to extend their visas or get permanent legal status in the United States. Here's how Cuccinelli, the acting director of Citizenship and Immigration Services, outlined the reasons behind the move yesterday at the White House.
President Trump's administration is reinforcing the ideals of self-sufficiency and personal responsibility, ensuring that immigrants are able to support themselves and become successful here in America.
NPR's Pam Fessler has been following this and joins us. Good morning, Pam.
Good morning.
So we just heard Ken Cuccinelli say there, this is about self-sufficiency, personal responsibility. I mean, these are things that the Trump administration has talked about for a while. Why is this happening now?
Well, we've always had a policy in the U.S. of restricting immigrants who might become a public charge. That's somebody who relies primarily on the government to survive. But the law was already very vague. And what the Trump administration is doing is greatly expanding the kinds of aid that can be held against a green card applicant to include nutrition aid, health care. If there looks like they're going to use it at any time, their application could be denied. And we should note that we're talking about individuals who are in the country legally.
Right. People who have already come through legal means.
Right.
They just need some help from the government to make ends meet in
and
some
legally,
cases.
Yeah, and legally entitled to these benefits.
Right. So immigration activists, I imagine they're too pleased. What are they saying?
That's right. They're really angry. They predict that millions of immigrants and their families are going to be affected, and that this is part of a broader campaign by the Trump administration to target both illegal and legal immigration, and that it's especially targeted at low-income individuals.
Right. This is about poor immigrants.
Right. The advocates say these people are basically being told they are not welcome. Here's Maria Elena Incapia, who's executive director of the National Immigration Law Center.
This is part and parcel of the larger strategy that this administration has, which is basically let's make immigrants' lives so horrific and impossible that they will either hide because of fear or that they will self-deport.
And Rachel, we're already seeing an impact. Even when rumors began spreading that the administration was going to do this, social service providers, healthcare providers started seeing immigrant families pulling out of programs like Medicaid and food stamps, even if they were for their American-born children, because they were worried about what impact it might have on their status.
So what happens? Do any of these groups try to challenge this rule?
Oh, yeah. We're expecting lots of litigation. The National Immigration Law Center announced within seconds of Cuccinelli's announcement that it plans to sue to block the rule from going into effect October 15th. They say the administration did not give sufficient weight to the tens of thousands of objections raised during the rules process. They also contend that it's racially motivated, that it's meant to discourage people of color from entering the United States, which is something that the administration denies.
All right, NPR's Pam Fessler for us this morning on this story. Thanks, Pam. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
NPR has been investigating the conditions that prisoners and guards face at a jail where Jeffrey Epstein died.
Yeah, so this is called the Metropolitan Correctional Center. It's a detention facility in Manhattan, and this is where Epstein was being held on charges of sex trafficking before he was found dead in his cell on Saturday. The Department of Justice is now demanding an investigation. This is Attorney General William Barr speaking yesterday.
I was appalled and frankly angry to learn of the MCC's failure to adequately secure this prisoner. We are now learning of serious irregularities at this facility that are deeply concerning and demand a thorough investigation.
NPR's national security correspondent Greg Myrie has been looking into this and joins us. Hey, Greg.
Hey, Rachel.
So, broadly, what kind of reputation does this jail have?
Well, it's really known for a lot of these high-profile figures that have been held there before and during their trials. We're talking about the mob boss John Gotti, the financial fraudster Bernie Madoff, the drug lord El Chapo, Joaquin Guzman, and now Jeffrey Epstein. It's also known for pretty tough conditions there. Prisoners usually stay 6 to 12 months while they're going through the legal process, very limited education or recreation facilities. And I spoke with David Patton. He's the head of the Federal Defenders of New York. Now, this is a nonprofit that represents several hundred of the roughly 800 prisoners that are there at any given time. And he said some of their clients, or actually many of their clients, are often initially held at Rikers Island. Now, this is the New York City jail notorious for rough conditions. And here's what he said about it.
When we first meet them, they'll ask us if there's any way they can go back to Rikers, because as terrible as the conditions are there, it can be worse at the MCC.
Wow, they'd rather go back to Rikers. But getting back to the security element of this, Greg, El Chapo? I mean, this is a guy who was famous for breaking out of prisons. So security you would expect to be airtight.
Well, exactly. And in addition to the cases I've just mentioned, like El Chapo, you've had high-profile terrorism cases, dating back to the first attack on the World Trade Center in 1993, and then more after 9/11. But the MCC, as it's known, like many other federal jails and prisons, is considered understaffed. And this is according to Eric Young. He heads the federal union that represents correctional officers. He says there's simply too few officers working too many hours and overtime shifts. He says this problem is chronic, and there's thousands that need to be hired nationwide. And here's what he said about the MCC.
We've been ringing a bell. I could tell you there are dozens and dozens of missing correction officers at the MCC.
So they feel like they've been raising the red flag here. Attorney General Barr has promised a thorough investigation. But what about all those folks you talked to? Are they expecting any changes to come down the pipe?
They're really quite skeptical. Eric Young, the union leader we just talked to, he said that he had raised these concerns with El Chapo, that they needed more staffing there, and they had to bring in additional officers from elsewhere. And David Patton, the defense attorney, said he's been doing this work for 18 years. It's been chronic problems, medical issues, and mental health issues for the prisoners have never been sufficiently addressed, in his view.
Wow, lots of problems. NPR's Greg Myrie on that story. Thanks, Greg.
Sure thing, Rachel.
All right, we're going to focus in on Hong Kong again because anti-government protesters are back, occupying the international airport for a fifth consecutive day.
Yeah, this is a major airport, so a big mess for passengers, travelers. All flights were grounded there yesterday because of these demonstrations. And in the face of these escalating tensions, propaganda outlets in China have now been releasing videos showing military vehicles gathering near Hong Kong's border.
All right, we've got Mary Hui on the line. She's a reporter with Quartz Magazine based in Hong Kong, and she was at the airport. All this unfolds. She joins us on Skype. Mary, so protesters, they're back at the airport. I understand not as many as before, but still they clearly see occupying this particular space as a good way to get their message across. Why do you think?
I think for them that comes down to really two reasons. One, it really hits the government where it hurts the pocket. The airport, its direct, indirect, and associated economic impact really adds up to about 5% of the city's GDP. So that's where they want to hit the government. At the same time, it's also a highly symbolic place. They can get their message across out to international travelers. And I guess internationally, people are fascinated by airports as a hub of as the symbol of globalization.
Right, sure. And as soon as people across the world are inconvenienced by a particular hub being closed down, then people pay more attention. I mean, let's talk about China's response to this. David mentioned that there's this video circulating that shows Chinese military vehicles apparently assembling at this border city, an hour and a half or so away from Hong Kong. What are we to make of that?
Yeah, so China really has been ramping up their rhetoric over the past 2 weeks. They're calling the protests radical and violent, that it's starting to show signs of terrorism. And kind of within that context, we've seen more kind of saber rattling from them with the news of these armored trucks gathering. Earlier, we had reports of about 190,000 police officers doing a drill ahead of the 70th anniversary of the People's Republic of China. I think all of that, of course, needs to be taken with a grain of salt. China really won't stand to gain anything from sending in People's Liberation Army troops into Hong Kong. And at the moment, I think a lot of this talk about military and troops being across the border is just lots of saber rattling, as I said.
I mean, we talked about this the other day, but what is the breaking point here? I mean, protesters are digging in. Carrie Lam, Hong Kong's chief executive, doesn't appear to be giving in to any of their demands. I mean, mainly they want her out, right?
Exactly. I think given kind of the escalation in police tactics this Sunday, there's been some talk on forums and in online chat groups about whether this is the way to go, this kind of disruptive, fast-moving, unpredictable forms of protests with a lot of disruption. And we have a major march planned for this Sunday, and people have asked to have it be completely peaceful, and perhaps that is where the protesters need to focus their energies on.
Just briefly, is there one protester who stood out to you? Any anecdote you could share about what these people are telling you?
One woman yesterday at the airport told me in response to the violent scenes on Sunday, she cried herself to sleep, woke up crying, and every time she thinks about the violence, she cries again. That was quite touching, and this is certainly an emotional moment for everyone in Hong Kong.
Mary Hui, a reporter with Quartz Magazine based in Hong Kong. Mary, we appreciate you taking the time. Thanks for sharing your reporting.
Thanks for having me.
For the last 10 weeks, pro-democracy protesters in Hong Kong have been demonstrating everywhere. From the streets to Hong Kong's bustling international airport.
That's the sound of clashes between protesters and police outside the airport yesterday. All this started when the Hong Kong government proposed a law that would allow people charged of crimes to be extradited to mainland China. The protest movement has broadened now, and the demands are for true democracy in Hong Kong. The founding chairman of Hong Kong's pro-democracy party, Martin Lee, described just how high the stakes are for protesters.
The young people are prepared to give up their young lives to defend the city. Some of them have written wills already.
Officials in mainland China appear to be ramping up efforts to counter the narrative coming out of Hong Kong. These officials are doing things like propagating conspiracy theories about who's behind the protests and encouraging counter demonstrations that have become violent. Yet even as China ramps up this pressure, their options are limited.
And let's go to China now. NPR's correspondent in Beijing, Emily Feng, is on the line. Good morning, Emily.
Good morning.
So China was doing very little publicly in the early stages of these protests, right? Almost acting like they weren't happening. That seems to be changing.
Right. They realized the protests were not going to go away, and that poses obvious problems. But one of the bigger ones is that people back home in mainland China are going to learn of the protests, and they might be sympathetic. So now Beijing's made this calculation. They're going to signal to their people back home that things are under control and make sure they have the right narrative, that this is a protest that's being organized by radical elements in Hong Kong, and take the risk that they might anger protesters in Hong Kong more.
So is that strategy working? I mean, is the narrative that the government wants people to have the one that people seem to be believing? Like, what are people saying in mainland China?
Yes, almost 100%. The widespread belief here, talking to people in Beijing, is that the Hong Kong protests are at best self-destructive and at worst criminal. And one of the most popular conspiracy theories out there right now is that the U.S. CIA was the one that incited and funded activists in China and Hong Kong to protest. And pro-Beijing supporters now have this hero to rally around because last night, there were big protests again at Hong Kong's international airport, and they got really ugly. A Hong Kong mob beat up two men they suspected of being mainland Chinese agents, and even zip-tied one of them to a luggage trolley as they hit him.
Wow.
Well, it turns out that man was an employee at one of China's most nationalistic state tabloids, and his outspoken editor-in-chief immediately took to Twitter and Chinese social media to denounce the assault. And so when I woke up today, phrases like, "What a shame for Hong Kong," and "I support the Hong Kong police, you can beat me all you want," went viral on every single major Chinese social media platform.
Wow. So this really is moving to a new phase. And I suppose this could get even uglier if China responds in some heavy-handed way. How likely is that?
Still unlikely, but Beijing has other options at its disposal. It could put pressure on companies in Hong Kong. It already has. And most importantly, it could mobilize ordinary citizens to do Beijing's bidding. I talked to Min-Shin Pei early today. He's a politics professor at Claremont McKenna College in the U.S., and he says he can imagine a scenario in which
there are tens of thousands of young men. They don't wear uniforms. They're so upset about what's going on in Hong Kong, and somehow they become voluntary groups to maintain order. So we're talking about ordinary Chinese people, patriots, getting themselves involved in protecting Hong Kong.
So that would give Beijing plausible deniability that they have a hand in any crackdown. And it's also why it's so important that Beijing gets the message right in China.
Interesting. We've seen reactions like that involving people that are not in uniform from countries like Russia as well. NPR's Emily Fang talking to us about the situation in Hong Kong and the possible response from China. She's in Beijing. Emily, thanks so much.
Thank you.
All right, now we turn from China's tensions with Hong Kong to China's tensions with the United States.
So much tension. The Trump administration announced yesterday it's going to postpone implementing new tariffs on some Chinese-made goods. These tariffs were supposed to go into effect next month, and they would have affected products like cell phones and laptops. And that could have meant higher prices on items that Americans want to buy during the holiday shopping season, which President Trump told reporters that he wants to avoid.
All right, NPR's Scott Horsley has been following all of this and joins us. Hey, Scott.
Good morning, David.
Okay, so how did this postponement of these tariffs come about?
Well, remember, David, the president had abruptly announced these tariffs just a few weeks ago. Out of frustration with the slow pace of trade negotiations with China. They were set to take effect on September 1st, so importers and retailers were kind of bracing for that. And then yesterday morning, the president's trade representative announced that some of the tariffs, including those on items like cell phones and laptops, and also some toys and clothing and video game consoles, those tariffs would be postponed until December 15th. Now, it certainly seemed like the timing suggested the administration was trying to avoid hitting consumers during the busy Christmas shopping season, and President Trump did confirm as much when he was talking to reporters yesterday.
But Scott, square this for me. Wasn't President Trump saying all along that tariffs are not hurting the U.S. economy, that China's the one being punished? Is he basically reversing that now and saying like, oh, yeah, tariffs could actually hit American consumers?
That's right. This is a tacit acknowledgement by the president that tariffs are paid, at least in part, by Americans, not by China. Trump has long disputed that, but the administration's actions suggest his own economic advisors know better.
So even with this delay, I mean, this is not a full reprieve for China in any way, right?
No, this is a partial reprieve. The original target list was going to hit something like $300 billion worth of Chinese imports. Something over half of that has now been postponed until mid-December. But we still have about $112 billion worth of Chinese imports that are subject to new tariffs starting on September 1st. And then there were some items that the administration dropped from its tariff target list altogether, including, for example, Bibles. Turns out we buy a lot of Bibles imported from China.
I didn't know
My
that.
colleague Alita Selyuk spent some time yesterday combing through the thousands of tariff line items, and it's idiosyncratic. I mean, nuts in a shell, for example, those tariffs are going to take effect in September. But nuts that have been shelled, they get a reprieve till December.
That's amazing.
If it sounds a little nutty, imagine how retailers feel. David French is a senior vice president with the National Retail Federation.
It's very difficult to operate a retail business when you don't know from month to month or week to week what the prices of your goods in the future will be.
So could this postponement impact U.S. trade policy in some way, Scott?
You know, this is not the first time the president has threatened tariffs and then backtracked, and so other countries are having to think twice. You know, do they want to call the president's bluff or simply wait him out?
NPR's Scott Horsley on the president's tariff delay. Scott, thanks.
You're welcome.
So one of opera's most recognizable and popular stars is now facing allegations of sexual misconduct.
The Associated Press published allegations yesterday from 9 women who say that Plácido Domingo sexually harassed them. They say the misconduct occurred over 3 decades. Not long after the AP's story came out, the San Francisco Opera and Philadelphia Orchestra both canceled upcoming performances by Domingo. He is one of the most powerful artists in opera, which is a highly competitive, highly insular world. And the whole thing raises questions about how serious the consequences of the allegations might be.
All right, we're joined by NPR's Anastasia Tsiolkas, who's been covering this. Good morning.
Good morning, David.
So, I mean, as Rachel said, some operas are already making some decisions based on these allegations. To take us through exactly what he's been accused of here.
Sure. The Associated Press published allegations from 9 women who alleged that Domingo tried to pressure them into sexual relationships in exchange for jobs and performance opportunities. And many of those stories are very similar, David. The women say he would persistently approach them, express interest in their careers, and urge them to meet him at his apartment or hotel room. And several of the women told the AP that there was unwanted physical contact, ranging from kissing and groping to unwanted sexual encounters. As one of them said to the AP, quote, "I was totally intimidated and felt like saying no to him would be saying no to God. How do you say no to God?"
Oh, wow. Some of the allegations, right, go back years, like to the 80s. So
That's right.
Are the accusers bringing evidence back from those times?
Well, 8 of the 9 women made their allegations anonymously. They told AP reporter Jocelyn Gecker that they are still fearful of professional retribution. The AP says it corroborated the women's stories with colleagues, friends, in one case a husband. And the AP also says it spoke to more than 30 other people who say they witnessed inappropriate behavior from Domingo.
What is the reaction to this in the opera world?
Well, the LA Opera, where Domingo has been general director since 2003, says it's hiring outside investigators to look into the allegations. And New York's famed Metropolitan Opera says Domingo will continue to sing there, at least for now. The Met says it will wait to make any final decisions until after the LA Opera issues its findings. I think it's important to remember, though, David, Plácido Domingo is one of the most popular and successful opera singers ever. He's 78 years old now, but he's still a huge box office draw. He was, of course, one of the 3 tenors alongside the late Luciano Pavarotti and Jose Carreras, and casual fans have some very fond memories of that group. He also has a very broad career along with directing LA Opera. He conducts orchestras around the world. He runs a very prestigious international competition for young singers, and he holds enormous sway in business. And this is an industry that has enough professional gatekeepers as it is. I think the stakes here are pretty high.
And so what's he saying?
He issued a statement yesterday to NPR that was not exactly a denial. It says in part, quote, "The allegations are deeply troubling and as presented inaccurate." He also said, "I believe that all of my interactions and relationships were always welcomed and consensual."
NPR's Anastasia Tsiolkas, thanks so much for your reporting.
Thanks for having me.
It was a doozy of a day on Wall Street. That is probably not the technical term for the massive plunge in the market, but we probably can't repeat the language likely used on the trading floor as the Dow Jones Industrial Average fell 800 points yesterday, making it the worst day for stocks this year.
Now, what's kind of weird about this is that this big slide came just a day after the Dow actually rose a lot after the Trump administration announced it would postpone tariffs on some Chinese goods. So why this sudden and really steep turnaround?
Who better to ask than NPR's chief economics correspondent, Scott Horsley, who joins us this morning. Hi, Scott.
Good morning, Rachel.
So, as David noted earlier this week, big surge in the Dow. Next day, it tanks. How come?
You know, if you pull the camera back a bit, Tuesday's up day in the market after the president announced that he was postponing some of those tariffs actually stands out as kind of the lone bright spot. You know, it followed a 400-point drop on Monday, a string of big losses in the market last week, and then yesterday's big plunge when both the Dow and the S&P 500 dropped around 3%. There's just been a lot of volatility, a lot of nervousness. We got news yesterday that Germany's economy actually contracted in the most recent quarter, We also got some disappointing data about China's factory production. Both Germany and China are big exporters, so that signals a lot of anxiety about the softening world trade. And then there was that worrisome signal from the bond market, which the president tweeted about in all caps as the crazy inverted yield curve.
What does that mean? I mean, I will cop to not knowing what the inverted yield curve is about.
Okay, ordinarily the payoff on long-term government debt is higher than the payoff on short-term debt. Investors get a reward for tying up their money longer. And if you plot that out on a graph, the curve bends upward like a smiley face. What's unusual is when the curve turns upside down, and you get a lot of frowny faces on Wall Street, and that's what happened yesterday. The yield or the payoff on the 10-year Treasury note dropped below that on a 2-year note, and this gets a lot of attention because historically that's often been a harbinger of a looming recession. Now, that doesn't mean it's going to happen tomorrow, but it does signal some concern about the path the economy's on. We still have low unemployment. We still have pretty good consumer spending. But we have seen a drop-off in business investment, and, of course, all this trade tension's not helping.
Happy face, smiley face. Scott, you could be an econ teacher in high school. I would have taken your class. So what about the Fed? Because this has been a favorite target of President Trump. Yesterday, he directed a personal attack at Fed Chairman Jay Powell, blaming him in particular for some of the economic market jitters we're seeing right now. What point is the president trying to make with that?
Yeah, the Fed has become the president's favorite whipping boy or scapegoat or distraction from the president's own policies, and yesterday was no exception. He wants the Federal Reserve to act more aggressively to cut interest rates. Now, the Fed insists it's driven by economic data and not political pressure, but if the economy continues to soften, the president may get what he wants.
Here's the how-to part of the segment. People are going to look at a bad day in the market, think about their own investments, obviously, with their retirement accounts. Should people be worried?
You know, if you're thinking about retirement savings and retirement's still many years away, all this is probably just a footnote, nothing much to worry about. For the president, though, who likes to use the stock market as a scorecard, his time horizon's shorter than that. President's up for re-election in 15 months. He used to boast about all the people who thought they'd become investing geniuses when their 401ks jumped. Over the last year, the stock market has pretty much been treading water. And the real challenge now is going to be if that spreads to the wider economy, then it won't just be the bond market where we're seeing all those frowny faces.
NPR's Scott Horsley. Thanks, Scott.
You're welcome.
All right, we're going to turn now to Philadelphia because there was this 8-hour police standoff last night that came to an end pretty late in the day.
Yeah, so police say they were going to try and serve a drug warrant, and then gunfire erupted, and this confrontation just went from bad to worse.
We got several shots, officers. We got an officer down. I need long guns, what?
You can hear their officer down. The suspected gunman wounded 6 officers who ended up in the hospital, fortunately with non-life-threatening injuries. This is what Philadelphia Police Commissioner Richard Ross had to say about the shooting.
We are very, very lucky with 6 police officers shot in one incident. It is remarkable that, I believe a couple of them have been released already. And so it is nothing short of astounding that in such a confined space that we didn't have more of a tragedy than we did.
All right, for more, we're going to turn now to NPR's Jeff Brady, who is in Philadelphia. I guess, Jeff, how did it start? I mean, why were police targeting the house in the first place?
Well, about 4:30 Wednesday afternoon, officers were serving a narcotics warrant, and police say the situation, it turned dangerous almost immediately. Officers were inside the house. They were headed toward the rear where the kitchen is, and police say that's when gunfire erupted. Officers, of course, they returned fire. They tried to escape. Police Commissioner Richard Ross, he painted this really dramatic picture of officers escaping wherever they could, through windows, through doors. He described it as a barrage of bullets, and they didn't stop. The suspect kept firing for hours afterwards. As you mentioned, 6 officers were struck by gunfire, one actually in the head, but none of those injuries was life-threatening. They were taken to 2 local hospitals that are right there, very nearby, treated and released a few hours later.
Do we know anything at this point about the suspect?
He's 36 years old. His name is Maurice Hill. It sounds like officers may have had some idea that he might be dangerous. Hill reportedly has a pretty long criminal history, and the local newspaper, The Inquirer, says that he'd resisted attempts to be arrested in the past.
How did police ultimately get him out of the house?
It took more than 7 hours, and they talked with the suspect on a phone that was in the house. They said he picked it, or at least they called him on a phone that was in the house. Early on, they said he picked it up a few times but didn't answer. They used a loudspeaker to try to convince him to come out peacefully. They even told him that police officers who were injured would survive, trying to encourage him to end the standoff peacefully. They're also were worried about what the police chief early on referred to as a potential hostage situation. 2 officers and 3 people they had arrested before the gunfire started were stuck in the house for hours. Eventually, a team was sent in to get them, and those 5 people got out fine. Then right around midnight, the suspect, Maurice Hill, came out of the house with his hands up, and police say he's in custody.
And have charges been filed?
Well, clearly he's going to be facing much more than drug charges now. Police also are thinking about how they serve these types of warrants. They're going to be examining this incident to see if there's anything they can learn to prevent violence from happening in the future.
NPR's Jeff Brady in Philadelphia for us. Jeff, thanks.
Thank you.
One of the hardest things to preserve in any organized movement is unity, keeping everyone together. Disagreements over goals and tactics can and often do undermine the cause.
Yeah, so let's talk about what's happening in Hong Kong, where protesters have been pushing for more freedoms from China. There are signs now of divisions within this pro-democracy movement. The protests there, let's remember, started over a bill that would have allowed people in Hong Kong to be extradited to China to face criminal charges. In recent days, though, there have been more instances of protester violence, even though the movement has been demonstrating against police brutality.
Okay, NPR's Anthony Kuhn is back on the ground in Hong Kong. Anthony, let me first ask about these reports that protesters at the airport have been wearing signs saying, "I'm sorry." What's that all about?
Well, it's mostly about Tuesday night. What happened at the airport then was that protesters grabbed 2 mainland Chinese men, one of them a journalist, the other a suspected policeman. They mauled them. They beat them. Medics were prevented from getting them in to take them out. And the protesters hassled travelers just trying to get through. They clashed with police. One officer drew his gun, and luckily nobody got shot. So now protesters realize they blew it. They acted like a mob. Many of the protesters are feeling bad. They're feeling reflective, and some of them apologized. And there are people who think that's a good thing for the movement. They've cleared out of the airport entirely now, and it's a de-escalation. This was getting really tense. People were afraid that it was going to lead to a government crackdown.
So, what does that mean for the broader goals, this push for democracy? The group itself, there's no organization to it, is it? It's a purely grassroots endeavor. Is it truly unified right now?
Well, that's right. It's a movement without leaders and a strategy of no strategy. All we can say for now is that the protests are going to continue, but this looks like an inflection point, a turning point, and for the first time, protesters are suggesting that, yes, they can beat a tactical retreat, and that's a very important thing. And they're reaffirming that they can do this without injury. Another thing is that the police have admitted that they had undercover cops working among the protesters, and the protesters can now point in that violence and say, hey, maybe it wasn't us. Maybe it was the undercover cops that did it.
Is Carrie Lam talking about these accusations specifically of not just the police brutality, but, the placement of undercover cops within the movement? Carrie Lam being the chief executive of Hong Kong.
Yeah, right. Well, it's mostly the police who've been addressing these charges, and they say, yes, we did have undercover cops posing as demonstrators, but they were not stirring up violence as people have accused them. They didn't do anything illegal. All the charges saying that, they used tear gas improperly, that they fired rubber bullets at close range. They have denied any impropriety, and that makes people very, very mad. And it's just, it's really interesting now that for the first time we have protesters who were previously saying, we're not going to quit, we're not going to step back, actually stepping back for a minute.
Have you heard from anyone who's against the protests, who now thinks it's time for everyone to go home?
There have been those voices all along, and there are also Beijing voices within Hong Kong, but Beijing has been not so effective in mobilizing those.
NPR's Anthony Kuhn in Hong Kong reporting for us on this ongoing story. Thanks, Anthony. We appreciate it.
Sure thing, Rachel.